Section 1 today is nervous system organization. In this section, we're going to take a look at a bunch of different types of organisms and look at their characteristic nervous systems. We'll look at the basic layout and components of the nervous systems in a bunch of different groups of animals. The idea here is to see how the body plan and complexity is related to the nervous system complexity. We're going to start with cnidarians, which are the simplest animals with a nervous system. So think back to when we introduced animals way back when we were doing phylogenetics. We talked about the derived traits of animals and how a nervous system is a derived trait of most animals, but not all animals. Well, we have to say but not all because it's a derived trait of eumetazoans, but it's not found in the non-eumetazoan animals like porifera. So porifera does not have a nervous system, but cnidaria, the basal eumetazoans, they have a nervous system. The layout of their nervous system is very different from what we think of in like vertebrates, which we'll see in a few minutes. Cnidarians have what's called a nerve net, which you can see outlined in purple here. It's just a series of interconnected neurons throughout the entire body. In a nerve net, there is no central control organ, so a stimulus can be detected anywhere in the body, and that signal will travel throughout the body. Notably here, impulses travel through the nerve net in both directions. So a stimulus that's received like over here at the mouth will travel through the body. A stimulus that is received over here down at the opposite end will travel through that nerve net using the same pathways going the opposite direction. This is a unique feature of a nerve net because, as we'll see going forward, and specifically over the next 2 days of class, when we talk specifically about things like action potentials and neuron structure, we're going to see how in all other nervous systems, the movement is unidirectional. Neurons are typically one-way streets. The exception to that rule is the most ancestral type of nervous system, the nerve net, where all of these pathways are bidirectional. So there's no central control organ, there's no brain here, and it is bidirectional signaling, both of which are very ancient ways of having a nervous system. And that's what we see in cnidarians. The second group we're going to look at in terms of their nervous systems is echinoderms. Now remember, echinoderms are bilaterians, but as adults, they lose many of their bilateral traits, and they almost look like they have radial symmetry. And the nervous system of echinoderms reflects that morphology. So echinoderms don't have cephalization, they don't have a head, and they also don't have a brain, but they do have a central control structure called the nerve ring. And you can see that nerve ring right here. It's this circular structure that kind of goes around the central disc of the organism. Radiating from that nerve ring are radial nerves, very appropriately named radial nerves because they radiate outwards down each arm, and it's those radial nerves that are going to signal the muscles in each arm of the organism. Now, notably, in echinoderms and all of the other organisms we're going to see today, the signaling pathways are unidirectional. You can only send and receive within a neuron in one direction. So you have to have a pathway out and a pathway back in. That's the case for everything we're looking at today, except for the nerve net that we already saw. Now, once we get to organisms that have clear bilateral symmetry as adults, we see a lot of variation. One example of this are within the Platyhelminthes, the flatworms. So the free-living members of this phylum are the planarians, or that's some of the free-living members anyway, are planarians. So this is a planarian right here. And if you are in a biolab, you may see planarians at some point because they're very common aquatic organisms. Planarians have what we consider the simplest, clearly defined central nervous system, or CNS. So at the anterior end, they have a brain. It's a very rudimentary brain, but it's still a structure we call a brain, and that is very closely associated with those eye spots that allow these organisms to detect light and dark and move appropriately based on the amount of light. From that brain, we have what's called a ladder-type nervous system, where we have two longitudinal nerve cords running down the length of the body in parallel to each other, and then structures called transverse nerves making up the rungs of that ladder. So you see, like, you've got the two longitudinal nerves or the sides of the ladder, and then you have transverse nerves every so often that make up the rungs. So a signal can go from the brain down the transverse the signal can go from the brain down the longitudinal nerves and then split and radiate along those transverse nerves as necessary. Once you get to organisms like annelids and arthropods, you start to see a much more complex, much more clearly defined structure that you would call a brain. So here we can see a leech. This is a segmented worm that I've mentioned before at the anterior end. You have this bundle of neurons that you would call a brain. And in a grasshopper over here, in an insect, you have a very clearly defined brain. These organisms also have nerve cords that run longitudinally through the body. And along those nerve cords, we see ganglia, which are just clusters of neurons that are found in segments. This is really important considering the morphology of these organisms because both the annelids and the arthropods have clear segmentation as adults. So these ganglia are basically neurons that radiate outwards from the nerve cord into each of the segments of the body. So basically each body segment is associated with a ganglia. Once we get to vertebrates, we see two clear functional parts of the nervous system. We have the brain and the spinal cord. So you have your brain and the spinal cord, which make up the central nervous system. And then the nerves and the ganglia that radiate from that central nervous system make up the peripheral nervous system. We're not going to worry anymore about the central or peripheral nervous systems right now because we're going to spend time on those in a few minutes. The last thing I want to mention in this section is how the nervous system structure is related to the lifestyle of the organism. So far, we've seen how the nervous system structure is related to the morphology and the complexity of the body, but the nervous system structure is also a function of the complexity of the lifestyle. And to see how nervous system complexity is a function of lifestyle, we can look at two different groups of mollusks. So on the left here, we have a group of mollusks called the chitons. The technical name for them is Polyplacophora, polyplac because they have lots of shells, so that's what that name means. The chitons have kind of not great way to make a living. Basically, they have this shell that's kind of dome-shaped, and the body is just within that segmented shell. And the radula faces downward. Remember, mollusks, they have that radula. And chitons, they live on like rocks or the bottoms of lakes and streams and bodies of water, and they basically make their living by having this big armored dome, and they scrape algae off of the rocks. That's what they do. It's not a super complex lifestyle. Basically, they're not going to run really fast or camouflage or anything. Their defense is just they have this big, heavy, very protective shell, and they don't do a whole lot else other than slowly move and scrape algae. Now, if you look at the chitin nervous system, it is highly diffuse, and they have a central nervous system, they have a brain, but it's not really a well-defined organ that we would call a brain that we would be familiar with as something we would go, aha, that's a brain. It is kind of this more diffuse network of structures at the anterior end of the organism. They don't live a very complex lifestyle in terms of problem solving or interacting with their environment, so they don't need to have a very complex central nervous system. Compare that to a squid on the right here. Squid are cephalopods, which are some of the best problem solvers among invertebrates. Things like squid and octopus, they're really good at lots of different things. So they can hunt, they can camouflage, they can avoid predators. They have a very complex lifestyle that involves interacting with their environment in extremely complex ways. And in order to succeed in that lifestyle, they have to do a lot of information processing. So the central nervous system of the squid is extremely well developed. They have very complex brains that are capable of higher order problem solving. These two organisms are very closely related. They're both mollusks, but because their lifestyles are very different, they've adapted two very different nervous systems. That's the last point I want to make in this section 1 on nervous system organization.